He is 74 now. 2 grown children, 3 grandchildren, a house filled with laughter on holidays, and a habit of waking before dawn because old routines never quite leave. His name is William Carter, though everyone calls him Will. He is happily married to Linda. Sunday mornings smell of coffee and the quiet comfort of 2 people who have learned each other's silences. And in his workshop, there is a small wooden drawer that holds no tools. Inside lie things no one asks about at family dinners. One November morning, his grandson, digging through boxes of Christmas lights, found a small silver pendant, tarnished, engraved with a woman's name, Eleanor. On the back, a date and a tiny cross worn smooth by time. The boy carried it to his grandfather with a dozen questions. Will took it quickly, as if it were warm metal straight from a flame. That drawer had stayed closed for decades. His life was good now. Volunteer work at the Veterans Center, gardening, a dog that followed him like a second shadow. But some stories never end, even when the people in them have. They return at night when the house is still, asking to be told one last time. The medal belonged to a nurse he met in 1970, when the war in Vietnam was still a place, not a paragraph. Her name was Eleanor Byrne, Ellie to most. She served with the Army Nurse Corps near Da Nang. Will was a Marine, part of a company that kept finding itself in the same valleys from which helicopters rose heavier than they landed. That evening, after everyone slept, he sat in the workshop holding the pendant. It felt heavier than silver, dense with what if and almost. Some memories are not about regret. They are simply proof that you once risked everything human inside something inhuman. Ellie was that proof.
In 1969, he arrived in central Vietnam with the Marine Corps. They were stationed near the Hai Van Pass, a stretch of jungle where the ocean breathed through the trees. By his 3rd month, he could name places that didn't exist on maps: the hollow with the bent palm, the ridge that smelled of smoke before rain. The ambush came just after noon. Noise from 3 directions, the air suddenly thick with red dust. A piece of metal found his leg and opened it like bad luck. They dragged him behind a rock, tied a tourniquet, and waited for the world to cool down. When the helicopter finally lifted him out, he counted each rotation of the blades as proof that he was still counted among the living. The field hospital smelled of iodine, metal, and exhaustion. When he woke, a woman was leaning over him, adjusting an IV line. Her uniform was olive, her hands steady. Ellie Byrne moved like someone who had learned the value of not wasting movement. Her voice had the calm rhythm of people who carry order through chaos. He watched her work and felt something beyond gratitude, the faint, impossible pull of light inside the noise. War has a cruel sense of timing. It hands you meaning exactly when you can least afford it. Days became ritual. Dressings at dawn, broth at noon, helicopter rotors at night. She spoke little about herself. He learned her language instead. The way she straightened her gloves before touching pain, the pause she took before unwrapping a wound, the quiet exhale after saving another stranger. When his leg began to obey him again, orders came for evacuation to Japan and then home. He wrote her a short note, no confession, just thanks, and left it beneath a tray of instruments, knowing her hands would find it. As the helicopter carried him away, he felt the first clean breath he had taken in months, and the weight of something unfinished.
Tokyo first, then Walter Reed in Maryland. White walls, measured optimism, the slow arithmetic of recovery. 3 weeks later, a letter arrived.
The handwriting was neat, almost military. Ellie thanked him for his note and wrote of nights when the generators failed and lanterns turned the ward into candlelight. She said restraint could also be a form of care. He read the letter 3 times. It steadied him more than morphine ever had. They wrote for a year. His words came from therapy rooms and cold Boston mornings. Hers from tents that smelled of rain and bleach. He told her about learning to walk without limping. She told him about new nurses learning not to flinch at blood. Their letters were small bridges thrown across an ocean. Then, one spring, the mail stopped. A week, then a month. He told himself supply lines were slow. By the 3rd month, he understood war ends for everyone on a different day. He wrote to the hospital. The reply was bureaucratic and empty. He kept writing anyway, until silence became its own answer. Finally, he built a small drawer from pine and placed every letter inside. Not buried, kept, because keeping is sometimes another way of saying, "Thank you for existing." Years passed. He met Linda at a friend's picnic, a woman who laughed like she'd already forgiven the world. Their marriage was not a replacement. It was a beginning built on honesty, and the drawer remained, closed, but never hidden. Half a century later, on an ordinary morning, the mail brought a small package postmarked Iowa. Inside was an old photo, a folded note, and a short letter. "My name is Susan May. I worked with Eleanor Byrne in 1971 at a field hospital near Quinyon. She often spoke of a Marine named Will. She asked me to forward this if I ever found your name. I saw it recently on a donor list for the Veterans Fund. I hope this reaches you. Forgive the delay." The photo showed Ellie standing outside a canvas tent, smiling the way people do when they don't yet know the photo will outlive them. The note in her handwriting read, "If you're reading this, then everything happened as it should. I stayed another year after you left until our unit was withdrawn. When I came home, I joined a Catholic hospital as a Sister of Mercy. It wasn't escape, just a different kind of service. I never married. My heart already had a place." At the bottom, "Your letter with the photo reached me months later when I was already leaving. I read it anyway. Thank you." Will sat a long time with that letter in his lap. There was no anger, no regret, only understanding. She had chosen a path that demanded quiet devotion, and she had kept his memory not as wound, but as compass. He placed the photo on his workbench and the letter beside the pendant. For the first time in decades, he felt no need to hide any of it. Months later, the local Veterans Hospice invited him to speak at their annual gathering. He accepted, not to be honored, but to honor the others. After his talk, a woman approached, white-haired, kind-eyed. Her name was Rose O'Connor, a retired nurse from Iowa. She said quietly, "You knew Eleanor Byrne, didn't you? We worked together in Des Moines in the mid-70s. He nodded. Rose smiled softly. She told him Ellie had passed 15 years earlier, lung cancer, but peacefully. She remembered the pendant Eleanor always carried in her pocket, calling it her small promise of peace. That night, sitting outside the hospice, Will realized closure isn't about forgetting. It's about letting the silence mean gratitude instead of loss. The next morning, he brought Linda flowers and simply held her hand. Later, he told her everything. She listened, smiled, and said it explained why he never spoke ill of the past. Together, they opened the drawer. She read the letters, touched the pendant, and wept without sorrow. Will then wrote the story down, by hand, simply, truthfully, for his family. On the cover, he wrote, "For those who think love only lives in time." A week later, he donated a copy to the local Veterans Museum. His note read, "She saved more lives than any general. Maybe one of them was mine." That evening, his grandson asked if Eleanor had been his grandmother. Will said, "No, son, but because of her, I learned how to be the man your grandmother deserved." When the house grew quiet, he stepped onto the porch and turned on the lamp. Not as a symbol, simply because he liked light at night. And then he remembered her line from the final letter. "If you're reading this, it means everything happened right." He smiled into the dark. Not every love needs to survive the years. Some are meant to illuminate them. Will began volunteering more often after the meeting with Rose O'Connor. The hospice needed people who could fix things, lamps, drawers, radios, small pieces of the world that still mattered to those waiting quietly inside it. He liked the work. It was simple, honest, and without rank. Every Thursday, he'd sit in the hallway with his toolbox while the patients drifted in and out of sleep. Some recognized him from the Veterans Club. Others just saw another old man who still had grease on his hands and a straight back. One afternoon, as he tightened the screws on an oxygen cart handle, a voice behind him said, "I know that smell, machine oil and coffee." Will turned. The man in the wheelchair was thin, his skin paper pale, but the grin was sharp. His name tag read Corporal Jack Mendoza. Jack had been a medic with the Marines in 1970. Different company, same valley. As they talked, Will mentioned Da Nang, the evacuation, the nurses. Jack's eyes brightened. He remembered Ellie Byrne. Said she once patched him up after a mine explosion and then chewed him out for trying to walk too soon. They spent an hour trading ghosts. Before leaving, Jack said, "She was one of the good ones. She stayed longer than most. You could tell she'd left her heart with the ones she couldn't save." That night, Will sat in his truck outside the hospice long after the lights dimmed. For the first time, he let himself imagine her years after the war. Older, hair silvering, still moving briskly down corridors, carrying calm the way soldiers carry rifles. He realized that remembering wasn't the same as reliving. One hurts, the other heals. The following spring, the Veterans Center organized a trip to Washington, D.C. Will hadn't been to the Vietnam Wall since it was built. He wasn't sure he wanted to go now. But his grandson, Ben, a high school senior, insisted on coming along. At the memorial, sunlight reflected off the black granite-like water. Ben traced the engraved names, whispering them, as if they might answer. Will stood quietly until he reached a section he half remembered. Men from his unit, gone before they'd even learned to shave twice a week. Beside the wall, a group of schoolchildren listened to a guide explain the war in tidy sentences. Will almost smiled at the thought that history always sounds cleaner than it smelled. He took the pendant from his pocket, Ellie's cross, polished now from years of turning it between his fingers, and pressed it briefly to the stone. Not as prayer, but as thanks. He whispered her name once, then returned the pendant to his chest pocket. Ben watched, but didn't speak. Later in the bus, he asked what the medal was. Will told him it belonged to someone who taught him that mercy can be braver than fire. The boy nodded slowly, the way young men do when they've heard something they don't yet understand, but know they'll remember. After the trip, Will couldn't shake the thought of unfinished correspondence. So, one rainy evening, he sat at his desk, pulled out stationery, and began a letter addressed simply to Eleanor Byrne. He wrote it as if she might still be reading somewhere, maybe through someone else's eyes, maybe through the quiet itself. He told her about Linda, about their children, about how he'd learned to cook badly but confidently. He wrote about the hospice and about Jack Mendoza, who still laughed through pain. He admitted that for years he'd confused silence with loss, when in truth, silence had been her final gift, space for him to build a life. Halfway through, his handwriting slowed. He wrote, "You once told me in a letter that restraint could be a kind of love. I didn't understand then. I do now." When he finished, he didn't sign it. He folded the pages, slid them into an envelope, and placed it inside the same drawer with her old letters. Some words are meant to be spoken only once, to paper, to time, to yourself. On a clear September evening, Will drove to the small bridge over the Charles River where he used to fish with his son. He brought the pendant and the duplicate of the letter. The water below moved slow, carrying the last light of the day like it didn't want to let go. He stood there until dusk, thinking about how life, like a river, never really stops. It just changes names along the way. He opened the envelope, read the first line one last time, and then let it slip from his hand. The paper landed softly, floated, and was gone. He kept the pendant. Some memories belong to the living. When he returned home, Linda was on the porch waiting with 2 mugs of tea. He kissed her forehead and said simply, "I finished something tonight." She nodded, no questions. After 50 years, understanding had become their first language. Inside, he sat at the table where morning light always fell warmest. He wrote a note for Ben on a fresh page. "One day, you'll have memories that don't fit neatly in your life. Keep them anyway. They're proof that your heart served too." He placed it under a small wooden box, the drawer reborn, varnished now, its corners worn smooth from decades of handling. Outside, the porch light burned steady. He'd started leaving it on every night, not out of habit, but hope that some wandering soul, soldier or otherwise, might see it and find their way home.